All right, so here we're going to talk about the trends and patterns of divided government and presidencies and how it affects the president when he has a divided or unified government. It's very casual, so you can ask questions, you point things out. It's a safe space, so don't worry about being wrong, okay? So just as a review, the red, all red here, that signifies unified government. And then when the president is from a different party than Congress, either one or both chambers, that's a divided government. All right, so here we have 8 years of which divided or unified? Unified, okay? This is very unusual. This doesn't really happen. This is kind of a once in America sort of time. What happens in Kennedy's administration that brings everyone together? That's an important legislation that happens because they're unified. But what keeps everybody together? What happens to Kennedy? Yeah, he's assassinated. Yeah. So big events like Pearl Harbor or the assassination of Kennedy, they bring the country together. And so that's one of the reasons that we see 8 years of Democrats. One of the other reasons we see 8 years of Democrats is they're going through that realignment that I told you about, where there's Northern Democrats and there's Southern Democrats, and there just aren't a lot of registered Republicans at the time. So the Northern Democrats are pushing things like the Civil Rights Act, and the Southern Democrats are filibustering the Civil Rights Act. So there's just a lot of Democrats at the time. But yeah, they're able to do a lot of legislation. Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They put a man on the moon. Okay, you would not have been able to fund that as quickly as we did if you didn't have 8 years of unified government. All right. So Nixon and Ford have 8 years of divided government. And again, this is because of that realignment, because the Democrats are changing. So how do you think that affected Nixon? What?
Pretty badly.
Badly, yeah, because he's not able to pass a lot of legislation, right? And so he really has to focus on things that are within his control. So as the president, he can carry out and enforce laws. And so he can control the bureaucracy. And so he's able to do some economic deregulation. He reforms the grant system. All of that's still underneath his power. He goes to China. But there's another really big foreign affairs thing that happens during this time. It's huge.
I know there's something big, but I don't know if it was foreign affairs. I don't really know what it is, honestly.
I guess so. Huge. The Vietnam War. You've heard of that? All right. So the Vietnam War also happens during this time period, but he never goes to Congress and actually gets it authorized as a war. The entire time it's just the Vietnam conflict. Why doesn't he go to Congress? Because Congress would not have authorized it because of the War Powers Resolution Act. Okay, so President Carter has 4 years of unified, but he doesn't get a lot done. The late 1970s pretty much suck for everyone around the world. Okay, there's a worldwide recession, there's a worldwide oil shortage, there's inflation during a recession, which isn't supposed to happen, but somehow happens in the late 70s. There's a lot of political unrest everywhere, China, Russia, Central America, South America. It's just kind of a hot mess. And so no president's coming out of that having gotten a lot done or getting another 4 years. And we'll talk about the Iran hostage situation later. All right, so with Reagan, he has divided government the entire time. This is still divided, even though the Senate is Republicans. Does anyone remember why I said if you're the president, you want to have the Senate if you can only have one? Something special about the Senate's jobs. Did you guys go to that station? No, that's your last one. Or next one. So the Senate is in charge of approving all appointments. So judges, Supreme Court justices, ambassadors, diplomats, they approve treaties. So if you're the president and you can only have one of these, you want to have the Senate. And Reagan put 3 people on the Supreme Court. Okay, He put Clarence Thomas, who is the second African American, but the first female Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor, and then one of the old white men, I can't remember which one. And so he's able to do a lot with the courts. Does anyone kind of know what Reagan's a little bit famous for, or a lot of famous for? You know anything about Reagan? No. He was. Yes, he was an actor, and then the governor of California. So, a couple things Reagan's famous for is one, pushing Gorbachev to unify Germany, to take down the Berlin Wall, because remember, Germany was divided into East-West Germany, and Berlin was divided into East-West Berlin. So there's a famous clip of Reagan saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." All right, so Reagan does a lot of foreign policy stuff. He works with Russia a lot. So he kind of gets a little bit of credit for sort of leading towards the end of the Cold War, ending the Cold War. How much credit he actually deserves is like a whole other conversation. But you know his foreign policy focus because he had to constrict the Senate. One of the other things he's famous for is an economic policy. Does anyone know what that means? It's called Reaganomics. Have you heard that phrase? You're going to talk about it in econ, I promise. I just don't know when. So Reaganomics, or trickle-down economics. And so, again, that's something you're able to do if you have control of the Senate, because you can pick your Federal Reserve Chairman, you can pick the Secretary of the Treasury. So even though he has a divided government, because he has the Senate, he's still able to do a lot. He's just not going to pass a lot of legislation. So there's not a lot of big bills that come up in Reagan's compared to other presidents. But he's able to do a lot of economic stuff and also foreign policy. All right. So he's super popular, and his vice president gets elected. This is an anomaly, and he has divided government the whole time. And he passes, I believe the Americans with Disabilities Act is during this time, but for the most part, he doesn't get a lot really accomplished. And one of the reasons he's a one-term president is because Ross Perot runs as an independent, and so there are three people in the race, and so Ross Perot pulls the Republicans away from him. All right, so Clinton, his first 2 years are unified or divided? Unified. Okay, so he is able to pass some legislation. He's able to pass a really big welfare reform bill, which we're going to talk about next month, but he only wins with like 47% of the vote. So he doesn't have a lot of power in Congress. Okay, but I want you to watch the House. So look at the House. I'm going to go back in time now. What did you notice about the House? You want to do it again? Watch the House. It's Republican for the first time in 40 years. Okay, and that wasn't because the Democrats were really, really popular. It's because the Democrats were going through that realignment that I mentioned, and so they're changing. But the Republicans really, getting both the Senate and the House, all of a sudden, they took it as what they call a mandate. Like this was their time. And Newt Gingrich had what he called the contract with America. And he's going to put all these Republican agenda through. So do you think Bill Clinton passed a lot of legislation? No. Do you think he was going to be able to veto a lot of bills if the Republicans are really strong? No, because they're going to be able to override those vetoes, right? So he did what was called line item vetoes, where he would like veto part of a bill, and then they would have to override that part if they wanted to keep it, but that's questionably unconstitutional, so he had to stop. So he doesn't get a lot done. He does get impeached during this time period. Okay, so he gets impeached in the House. There's a trial in the Senate, but he doesn't get convicted or removed from office. And then at the end, he focuses on Israel and Palestine and trying to get a peace treaty between Israel and Palestine. That was really the closest we've been to that.
What was the other type of veto called?
The line item veto. So you just draw a line through one item and say, I don't want this part of the bill. But it's questionably unconstitutional. Actually hasn't been decided yet. So Clinton just stopped because people were like, we're going to take you to court. And says, fine, I won't do it anymore. All right, so George W. Bush starts with divided government, and then it's 4 years of unified government. What happens that unifies the country around him? Yeah, so September 11th happens, and everyone's like all on his train, and he gets a lot done. He passes the Patriot Act. He creates a Homeland Security Administration. He passes some tax reform bills, a lot of economic deregulations, the No Child Left Behind education bill. He gets a lot done in those 4 years, but then you can see it switches to a divided government. I think one of the reasons that happens is because a lot of Americans thought we would go right into Afghanistan and find Osama bin Laden right away, that we would take out Saddam Hussein and Iraq would instantly become a democracy. But it doesn't work like that. So people thought the war would be really fast, and it's still going on today. So it hasn't been. So I think that's one of the reasons he got some pushback.
Is that the same as what happened in Vietnam?
Yeah, the Vietnam War certainly went on much longer than people wanted it to. Yeah, people got over it. People weren't really sure to begin with, so the popularity for Vietnam wasn't very high in the beginning, which is why it was never declared a war, right? But Iraq and Afghanistan are formal wars through Congress, and they have pretty high pass rates through Congress. And that's because we were unified against a common enemy. We had been attacked. So President Obama starts with 2 years unified, and this is when he gets the Affordable Care Act passed. And then he has 4 years with just the Senate. So he gets a couple Supreme Court justices, lots of economic regulations. Okay, and then the last 2 years he really focuses on foreign policy again. He negotiates the Paris Climate Accord, negotiates the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So he just focuses on foreign affairs. Those last 2 years are also called a lame duck presidency because the president's not able to do a lot of legislation because people are like, you're not going to be president anymore. Okay. And then President Trump started with 2 years of unified government. Now, he is able to do his really big tax bill, which was a pretty significant piece of legislation. But does anyone remember why I said he wasn't able to overturn the Affordable Care Act? Something was going on with the Republicans. So, for the 6 years before, the Republicans are like, we got to overturn this, it's unconstitutional, it's a socialism. They finally get into power, and they're not able to do it. Why? So the Republicans are really divided. They have conservative Republicans, they have fiscal Republicans, they have libertarians, they have Trumpian Republicans, they have all these different groups in their party. So they all agreed they didn't want to have the Affordable Care Act anymore, but they couldn't agree on how they wanted to get rid of it. And now that ship has sailed, because that overturning it would have to start in the House, and the Democrats aren't going to do that. Okay? So based on the pattern of what we saw, okay, what should happen to the next 2 years? Should they become more unified or more divided? Yeah, more divided. Yeah. And then I just wanted you to watch the president real quick. Okay. So I'm gonna go back to the beginning. So Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican, ignore, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. So the pattern is that it switches back and forth between the two parties, and that usually presidents have 8 years. Okay. So based on that pattern, should President Trump be reelected? Yes. Yeah, he has a really good chance now, especially after this weekend when they killed the leader of ISIS.